Welcome everyone to Dawn's latest event titled Politics in an Accidental Crucible, a discussion of Sean Yom's new book, Jordan. We're excited to host this event and want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today for this important discussion, especially given Jordan's central role in the Middle East today and in the future, alongside the U.S.-Jordan relationship. For some quick background, Dawn is a nonprofit organization that supports democracy and human rights in the Middle East and North Africa. Our vision is for a world where the human rights, liberty, and dignity of every person in the Middle East and North Africa are upheld by democratically elected governments, safeguarded by independent institutions and civil society organizations working under the rule of law, and supported by international governments and institutions around the world. Our research, analysis, and foreign policy advocacy on MENA governments with close ties to the United States and on the military, diplomatic, and economic support the U.S. government provides them, since that is where we believe we have the greatest responsibility and the greatest opportunity for influence. Our goal is to ensure that U.S. foreign policy supports the people of the MENA region by ending support for their abusive, undemocratic governments. We believe that the U.S. national interests are ill-served by support for these governments and better protected by policies that foster peace, freedom, equality, and justice. As a small reminder, we do strongly encourage your participation in this event. Please share your questions or comments using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom application. We welcome your thoughts on the subject and hope you can engage our excellent panel of experts throughout the talk. So with that, I want to move on to some introductions. The star of our event is Sean Yom, is a Dawn Fellow and Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University. He is also a Senior Fellow in the Middle East program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is a specialist on regimes and governance in the Middle East, especially in Arab monarchies like Jordan, Kuwait, and Morocco. His research engages topics of authoritarian politics, democratic reforms, institutional stability, and economic development in these countries, as well as their implications for U.S. foreign policy. He is the author of From Resilience to Revolution, How Foreign Interventions Destabilize the Middle East, and the book that our event is focused on today, Jordan, Politics in an Accidental Crucible. We also have Matthew the Couture, who is an assistant professor of teaching in the Irvin D. Reed Honors College at Wayne State University. His research and teaching focuses on social movements, labor politics, and authoritarianism, with a regional focus on the Middle East and North Africa. His current book project, From Hegemony to Mobilization, Activism Under Authoritarianism in Neoliberal Jordan, explores how marginalized insider groups become motivated and empowered to mobilize under politically repressive conditions. We also have Benjamin Schutze, a senior researcher and research group leader at the Arnold Bergstresser Institute in Freiburg, Germany. His research focuses on the politics of intervention, trans-regionally connected authoritarian practices, and energy politics. He's the author of Promoting Democracy, Reinforcing Authoritarianism, U.S. and European Policy in Jordan. He's also a member of the International Editorial Advisory Board of Middle East Critique, and since 2025 has been a member of the new board of the German Middle East Studies Association. We also have some Dawn members joining us today, including our Executive Director, Sarah Lee Whitson. Sarah Lee previously served as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East North Africa Division from 2004 to 2020, overseeing the work of the division in 19 countries with staff located in 10 countries. Whitson has led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region, focusing on issues of armed conflict, human rights, accountability, and legal and policy reform. We also have Jamal El-Tahat, a senior advisor at Dawn. He has spent decades advocating for democratization in Jordan and has extensive research experience in many fields, including economics at the Jordanian Royal Scientific Society. El-Tahat worked as an instructor, researcher, and managing editor of the Strategic Journal at the Center for Strategic Studies at the Jordanian National Defense College. He then joined the Advanced Research Group as a visiting fellow with the British Royal Defense Academy for 5 years. Finally, we have Yara Betaina, who holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Jordan and a master's in international relations from the University of San Diego, where she wrote a thesis on political resilience and democratic development in the region with a focus on Jordan. She's an editorial associate with Dawn's journal Democracy in Exile. Her professional experience in Jordan has included supporting refugee-focused initiatives, developing civic education programs for youth and political parties, and contributing to projects that elevated marginalized voices. All right, so with that, I want to get over to our panel now. I'm going to pass over the floor to Sean to discuss his new book. So Sean, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Alexander, and thanks to everyone for being here today to talk about my latest book. I'm just going to hold it up here, right here. It's Available now on Amazon and on Oxford University Press's website. It is a lengthy book, but it is one that's filled with, I think, a critical amount of knowledge for anyone in the audience who doesn't know much about Jordan or may not even know much about the Middle East, but it's framed and written in a fairly accessible way. It's not a traditional jargon-filled technical political sciencey book where every chapter is a different, hypothesis of a sophisticated model. There is some theory in there, but there's much more historical context and usable information that I think should help those of you who want to do future work or research on the country. So I don't want to summarize the book per se because A, it's hard to do because it consumed the last 5 years of my life, and it's hard to kind of summarize a 140,000 word book in just 10 or 15 minutes. But I want to frame the book instead. I want to explain why I wrote it and how works like this book, but there are others as well, can help us rethink politics in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So the main reason why I wrote the book is that as someone who's worked on Jordan consistently as one of my primary countries of interest in the Middle East and North African region since graduate school 20 years ago, I always found it troubling that virtually every popular commentary on Jordanian politics, and to be very transparent, I'm guilty of doing this as well, kind of follows a cookie cutter template whereby there are certain stereotypes or tropes which are thrown around in the analysis to instantly acclimate and guide the reader into thinking about Jordan in a certain way. Jordan is framed, for instance, as a country that is perpetually on the brink or on the edge of disaster. And when it doesn't collapse with every passing crisis, it's instantly reframed like a perpetual survivor. So there's a kind of built-in story of resilience that pervades our understanding of Jordanian politics. There is another constant framing device used, particularly in Anglophone media, about Jordan being an oasis of moderation or calm or stability in a very turbulent environment of the Arab Near East. I mean, the area abutting Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And the problem with that trope is that it tends to define Jordan purely by its value or its importance to outside stakeholders like the United States, rather than looking at the kingdom for what it is. And then there's finally a tendency, I think, particularly among Western analysts, to look at Jordan almost exclusively through the lens of its royal kings. And there have only been a handful since Jordan was invented by British colonialism a little over a century ago. And the problem when you look at all of Jordanian politics through the optic of the royal gaze, you tend to lose sight of ordinary spaces of public politics and public life that, in my view, are where the really interesting struggles happen in the quotidian, day-to-day sort of existence of Jordan. So the main reason why I wrote the book was to deconstruct those three particularly destructive stereotypes or tropes: the on the brink narrative, the oasis of geopolitical moderation framing, and the idea that Jordan can be understood almost exclusively or largely through its royalism, and to instead refract the politics of Jordan through a host of other topics: its society, its political economy, its foreign policy, its authoritarian system of governance, its history of protest and democratic struggle, and all the other things that I think make up what I would consider to be one of the most fascinating countries in all of the Arab world, and certainly in the broader MENA region as well. Another reason, I'd say a secondary reason why I wrote the book, was to accentuate why. And this is particularly for those listeners and readers who don't know much about Jordan, to accentuate why, even by the extraordinary standards of Middle East politics, like this is an exceptional place when gauged against, again, even by the metrics of regional success. So consider that Jordan, right, as I've mentioned earlier, it's barely a century old. It was created largely as an afterthought of British colonialism when then colonial Secretary Winston Churchill was carving out new nations and states from the shattered remnants of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, or the Great War. But even prior to that, the area that we call Jordan was never a coherent administrative unit or province under Ottoman rule. It didn't have a tradition of statehood. This is a country that today has a very fractious national identity, and we can describe it in a number of different through a number of different approaches. But the word that I would use to describe Jordanian identity is noisy. There are contesting visions between the monarchy and officials and social movements and opposition groups and ordinary people about what being Jordanian means. And there are cross-cutting divisions within society that contest the very authenticity of being a Jordanian or Jordanian identity. And perhaps the most prominent, and one that those of us who've worked on Jordan know quite well, is the cleavage between Palestinian Jordanians, who comprise a majority of the citizenry, and Transjordanian or East Banker Jordanians, who are like Palestinian Jordanians, Arabs, but they do not hail largely from the land that we now call Palestine. From a political economy perspective, consider that Jordan is one of the few Arab countries that has neither oil nor water, and it has a very small, struggling economy that frankly doesn't produce much of value that the world needs. And yet it's an economy that seems to get by year after year. From a political perspective, Jordan is a country that virtually every political scientist, as we know, would classify as an autocracy, a non-democracy whose political regime structure revolves around one of the last 10 ruling monarchies of the world, the Hashemite dynasty, which putatively descends from the Prophet Muhammad himself. This is also, from a political economy and institutional perspective, one of the most militarized countries in the world. If you go by any conventional benchmark of militarization, the percent of the male labor force in uniform, the percentage of national spending each year that goes to security institutions or the Jordanian armed forces, this is among the 10 most militarized countries in the world. And this is a country that hasn't fought a real war in 50 years. Right. And military and security spending in this country is one of the factors that drives the perpetually indebted government towards insolvency, only to be bailed out by gobs and gobs of multilateral assistance and outside foreign aid, and a fair amount of public debt as well. And then finally, consider the neighborhood of Jordan. Jordan historically has been a sponge for refugees who have been violently expelled from nearby conflict zones, not just Palestinians, but also Iraq and Syria. And it's also squeezed into a neighborhood that, if you look at Jordan's geography on a map, I mean, it's wedged in between Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. If you were to put an Arab country in almost any part of the Middle East, this is the last place that you would think would be would guarantee a trajectory of stability or success. One diplomat who I quote in the book once called this a Jordan's neighborhood is a quote crossroads of catastrophe, right? Just to not to draw hyperbole into our discourse, but that's just one framing that Westerners have used to think about Jordan. And finally, Jordan is, I think, one of the few Arab states that's truly a keystone to the Palestinian question. Not just because Jordan borders the West Bank and Israel, and not just because a majority of Jordanian citizens are of Palestinian origin, but because what happens in Palestine may reverberate across the Arab world, but it will land first in Amman, and it will impact Jordanian society to an extraordinary degree. And Jordan, of all the Arab states, particularly the frontline states like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, has the most to gain and the most to lose from the potential adjudication or the dissolution of a future Palestinian state. So, in this other plank of analysis I've been describing, these are all the qualities that make Jordan an exceptional Arab country, even by the standards of the Middle East and North Africa. And let me throw one other analytical tidbit into the equation. And this is the one of the very few Arab states, particularly in this neighborhood, that's never seen revolution or state collapse. Right. It's unlike most of its neighbors, and certainly unlike many of the other Arab states during and after the Arab Spring. As the book describes, there are very good reasons for that stability. And the fact that Jordan has experienced, again by regional standards, a trajectory of political stability has never meant that Jordanian politics is static. As I note in some of my more vivid chapters, there are not just glimmers, but graphic episodes of uprising and struggle that punctuate Jordanian history. And in fact, one of the goals of my book is to maintain that the political history of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is indeed a history of the Hashemite monarchy. It's a history of authoritarianism. It's a history of Palestine, but it's also a history of struggle, and it's a history of uprising, and it's a history of state society contestation. All of these things, I argue, refract into what I would call the real politics of Jordan, and in which the quotidian stuff that we assume just doesn't really happen in Arab countries, which are better conflated with crisis zones, actually happen every day. Political conflicts happen, protests happen, institutional struggles happen, foreign policy uncertainties happen, and real economic emergencies and recalibrations happen, particularly right now as Jordan attempts to find some fiscal and I would say macroeconomic footing, given the very perilous time that the entire region is facing, partly as a consequence of Israeli militarism against Palestine and a number of other conflict zones in the region. And so, just to sum up this very brief preamble, these are all the reasons why I wrote this book. I mean, this book is a compendium of facts and contemporary events in Jordan, but it's also a primer about how not to think about the kingdom. Do not think about Jordan as being a tidy Arab state that's perpetually on the brink, but then just survives through the royal magic of its monarchy or through the profundity of Western donors. Don't just think of Jordan and define the country purely by its value to Western stakeholders who like to think of Jordan as an oasis of moderation and calm, right? And that may be very true when you're neighboring Syria, but right, that's a very low benchmark, unfortunately, that the region gives us. If you put Jordan as a country in many other regions, it certainly, I think, wouldn't be called an oasis of anything. It would just be called for what it is, which is an interesting country, an exceptional country, but it's a country filled with political struggle whose story is still being written every day by not just its government, but by ordinary people. And so, by interrogating Western biases and by trying to unpack all this empirical and theoretical knowledge, my hope is that this book and our collective work here, as all of us who are Jordanian aficionados, try to make Western and just more broadly speaking, global Anglophone commentaries about Jordan a bit more reflexive, a bit more responsive, and a bit more transparent, particularly in this current moment. And I know that we'll get to this in discussion in just a bit, but let me just insert one last provocative rejoinder in my belief that I think Jordan is being impacted by what's happened in Gaza. And I think that the future dissolution of a potential state of Palestine in such dramatic ways that we may be looking potentially at the most perilous years of Jordanian history. And I don't use those words lightly because much of the book is an effort to deconstruct the troubling tendencies of Western analysts to call Jordan as a crisis-packed country when it looks like it's about to collapse, only to celebrate how it's an open, tourist-friendly, pro-Western, pro-American place when it seems stable. And that's true whenever Jordan undergoes some domestic event like a crisis or an Arab Spring or some political controversy. But what's happening in Palestine is fundamentally different. Because unlike every past domestic challenge Jordan has faced, whether it's an economic meltdown or a popular movement or the Muslim Brotherhood, which shouldn't pose much of a challenge now because it was banned in April 2025, the Palestinian crisis is an emergency that Jordan can neither fight nor flee. It can't flee the crisis because it borders Palestine and Israel, and the majority of its citizens are of Palestinian origin. And its history has always been intertwined with both the Zionist movement as well as the Palestinian question. But it can't fight it because Jordan's foreign policy is deeply constrained by the 1994 peace treaty with Israel, which was arbitrated and backed by the United States. And as I've written before, both for Dawn and other outlets, the U.S. effectively blackmails Jordan into maintaining that peace treaty with Israel by essentially insinuating that should Jordan engage in any foreign policy maneuver that stands outside the permissible boundaries of that hegemonic of that hegemonic arrangement, then Jordan's foreign aid, particularly from Washington, will greatly diminish, and so too will the streams of security assistance that have helped secure Jordan's borders and arm and maintain their Jordanian armed forces. So Jordan can't fight what's happening in Gaza and Palestine now. So this is an external crisis that Jordan cannot fight and it cannot flee. And if the worst case scenario materializes, in which an Israeli American condominium essentially displaces not just the Palestinians of Gaza or imposes an apartheid regime on Gaza, but facilitates the impending Israeli annexation of the West Bank and expels 2 to 3 million more Palestinians onto Jordan and what would surely be another Nakba, then the consequences economically, socially, and politically for the kingdom would be disastrous. And I think we have to critically reassess how we got to that point through our discussion, and also to understand the position that Jordan faces now because of that crisis. And I will end here. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, that was excellent breakdown of the book and strong analysis to kind of guide our discussion moving forward. Before we jump over to Ben, I just want to share with the audience a really good review from Ezra Carmel, who reviewed Sean's book. We published it on Dawn's Democracy in Exile Journal. That can give you a little bit more background on the book as well. And so that's now in the chat for all of everyone to see. Ben, you can go ahead now. The floor is yours to discuss Sean's book.
Oh, wonderful. You can all hear me?
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having invited me, first of all. Unfortunately, I haven't yet managed to meet you, Sean, in person, but I always very much liked your publications and I found them extremely helpful also for my own work. So it's a real pleasure to now finally meet you. Let me begin by saying that as I read your book, I couldn't help but think that I should have started my PhD 15 years later, because in this case, I would have had the advantage of being able to use your book as a foundation to benefit from and build on. You formulate your objective as wanting to provide, I quote, a roadmap for understanding the people and politics of Jordan. This is, of course, quite ambitious, but the book provides exactly this, drawing on an impressive number of sources, including on interviews that you conducted during various trips to Jordan, I think since 2006. The book provides an extremely comprehensive account of Jordanian politics. What stands out most, in my opinion, is this impressive scope of the book and how you, despite this impressive scope, still managed to pay such close attention to detail. From the origins of the Hashemite regime's tribal coalition in the 1920s to ongoing protests against the genocide in Gaza, from the diverse meanings that Jordanians from all walks of life attribute to religion, to the extreme degree of urbanization, from an in-depth discussion of the role of domestic strategies of coercion and coalition building for the protection of authoritarian rule, to analysis also of Jordan's position as a US client state. And finally, from a fine-grained description of the structural problems of Jordanian economy to the acknowledgement that while these do not predetermine problems of political outcomes, addressing these structural problems still requires, I quote, a complete rethinking of how money, markets, and people should coexist. I cannot really think of any major theme of Jordanian politics that the book does not cover. In some books, such a thematic broadness comes with a lack of focus. This is clearly not the case here. So the common umbrella for all chapters, and there's a slight risk of repeating some of the points you said, but I'm going to say it nevertheless, the common umbrella is this important critique of popular tropes about Jordan. So you beautifully deconstruct and take apart highly problematic myths about Jordan. These are first the language of emergency, which suggests that Jordan is constantly either about to collapse or barely surviving. And second, the idea that Jordan is an outpost of moderation, the internal workings of which don't really matter, given its position as a little cog in US imperialism. And third, the bizarre and highly Orientalist idea to understand Jordan via its royal family. On this note, I very much liked, for instance, the following statement, I quote, "Jordan without the Hashemites would be a very different place, but a country nonetheless. The Hashemites without Jordan, however, would be little, another deposed dynasty relegated to the footnotes of history." Drawing on this important critique of the kind of myths around Jordan that downplay the agency of Jordanians at large, I would like to make 2 points. These are not so much a critique, rather I'm interested in hearing more from you on these 2 aspects. So the first concerns what other scholars like Kuhn Bogart in the case of Morocco have described as, I quote, globalized authoritarianism. So in your chapter on Jordan's state institutions and in the following chapter on how coercion and coalitions create stable authoritarianism, you discuss the pillars of authoritarian rule in the country. You also explicitly in that chapter state that you discuss Jordan's dependence on the US in chapter 8 later on, which you do very in depth there. Here you then say that Jordan's foreign policy rests upon a close relationship with the US. And at various points, you also clearly state that Jordan is a US client state. Still, I was wondering whether in the map that you provide on page 65, for instance, which shows the authoritarian structure of Jordanian political power, whether one might perhaps also want to include the US embassy or some actor of US imperialism at large. Somewhat relatedly, later on, you say that, I quote, for Western governments, the Hashemite regime is imperfect. I couldn't resist but wonder in that context where and how you'd say that this is the case, as Jordan, to me, appears to be the dream regional partner for US imperialism. Secondly, I very much like your idea of Jordan as, I quote, a crucible of knowledge about how autocratic governance, democratic opposition, economic institutions, and geopolitical intrigue operate in the modern world, end of quote. I think this beautifully captures that we must take Jordanian politics in and of itself serious, rather than to constantly compare it to some supposed ideal type, and then always analyze it as lacking in this or lacking in that. To me, this idea also implies to decenter the West and to see what we can learn from politics in countries like Jordan, to then perhaps also better understand politics in the West, whatever that is. For instance, as you show in quite some depth, looking at Jordan tells us quite a lot about the evolution of European colonialism and US imperialism. Can Jordan, this pseudo-democracy or eternally liberalizing autocracy, as you describe it, perhaps teach us something about politics also in the West? It's quite clear also to the staunchest defenders of Huntington and co. that the world is, of course, not moving towards democracy, but that we're rather witnessing a convergence of governance types. So to be more concrete, as you discuss the Jordanian state's strategies of coercion, on page 95, you state that, I quote, in the 21st century, a regime cannot credibly claim to promote democratic values while committing mass human rights violations. But hasn't the Jordanian regime been doing exactly this for quite some time already? Similar to its Western backers, including the US and Germany for that matter, who are more and more obviously lifting the liberal facade. So can Jordan's attempt at making autocracy more durable via a democratic facade perhaps teach us something about where the West is increasingly heading to? So in short, first, I'd love to hear more from you about how you see the international dimension of Jordanian authoritarianism. And second, can we perhaps learn something from Jordan to better understand not just Jordan, but actually move beyond Jordan and better understand the West at large via Jordan even. So, but most importantly, congratulations on a really exceptional book, which will without doubt be of great help to generations of future researchers, journalists, students, and those interested in better understanding Jordanian politics. So thanks a lot. I'll stop at this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben. And I'm sure we'll get to some of those questions later on in our discussion. I want to jump over to Matt now for his brief review and similarly questions or anything that we can discuss later. Matt, go ahead.
Great. Thank you. You can all hear me?
Perfect.
So I guess I have a similar kind of introduction to this as Ben. One that I just recently met Sean at APSA and am in the sort of recipient of excellent comments that have set my book back sort of productively, maybe a couple months, but for the better, I think. And also mirroring Ben in the sense that, I kind of reading this book kind of got me thinking about when I first started working on Jordan, which actually wasn't all that long ago. So I'm quite new, I think, relative to most of you. So when I started doing my dissertation field work in 2018, I sat down with a Jordanian scholar, who sort of lamented to me that a lot of people come to Jordan to do work, but they don't come to do work on Jordan per se, right? They come to do work around Jordan on issues like refugees and the sort of regional dynamics and things like that. And of course, all those things are part of the tapestry of Jordan and its politics and society. but less work sort of just in people coming in and actually studying Jordan, as Jordan. I think, since then, since 2008, the balance has kind of shifted a little bit more towards more work coming in and really focusing on Jordan. And, Sean's recently written about this, but these sort of new kind of work on everyday authoritarianism in Jordan, Ben's work, a recent book, but also work from Jose Ciro Martinez and Gillian Schwedler's new book and Jessica Watkins' new book as well. So there's a lot more work coming in. And which is not to say that there wasn't a lot of great work before that, as Sean's previous book is sort of part of that, and Curtis Ryan and also Gillian Schwedler's work. So I think, if you're going to, again, sort of, I kind of have that sort of wish of, could I be, if I was working on Jordan starting today, it'd be a lot less sort of, scrambling around for things. And I think in that respect or in that context, Sean's book really kind of serves as, in some ways, a capstone on that. And Sean, you in the first introductory chapter, and as both you and Ben have highlighted, position the book as a roadmap and a roadmap to sort of understanding Jordan. You say that the book seeks to clarify who rules Jordan, who are asked to follow those rules, what happens when they refuse, and how those rules configure the domestic economy and foreign relations. And I think, by itself, this is already a laudable task, given that, as the book lays out, and as Ben sort of laid out as well, Jordan is this land of myths and myth making, both from within and without. And, I will kind of, I think a lot of my other panelists who especially deal a lot more with the advocacy space and the policy space probably confront these myths more on a daily basis than I do. So I'll kind of let you kind of expound to what degree you think the book serves as a sort of a guiding light in that respect. Though I do think that dispelling these imperialist, Orientalist, and also propagandizing myths about Jordan, already is quite a feat. I guess where I want to sort of jump in is sort of to put on my political scientist hat and think about it from that perspective and how I see the book sort of the contributions that the book makes in that respect. And so I think it also serves as a roadmap in another respect, which is especially through the footnotes of the book, it becomes a map to that new sort of strands of Jordanian scholarship and work on Jordan, and also a map that kind of links all of that work to all of these other disciplines and work that's been done in anthropology and history, and also this older sort of waves of Jordanian scholarship from some of the leading lights in the field who are still active today, many of them. So I think in that respect, there's a real sort of the book really is you know highly valuable in that it pulls these different strands of scholarship on Jordan together. And it also provides something in that respect that's sort of more than the sum of all those parts. I mean, partially that's because, Sean, you have your own this corpus of work, and also all of your rich, firsthand research and interviews and all of these things that you bring into this as well. And what comes out of that is a truly synthetic work of empirical analysis that produces a dynamic image of Jordan at the intersection of international relations, authoritarian politics, contentious politics, political economy, comparative history, and so on. So, given that I have a short amount of time and, I can speak on some of those things a little bit more authoritatively than others, I'll pick up one of those strands or a couple of them just to offer some fruit for discussion. So the chapter 4 was one chapter that I particularly latched on to, which covers the dynamics of authoritarian rule in Jordan, and takes as its point of departure this sort of axiom in authoritarian studies that autocracy is unsustainable through repression alone and requires a sort of balance of a consent and coercion or some sort of measure of both. In Jordan, the regime strategy thus involves a sort of reliance on coalition politics and primary low intensity repression, which that in of itself might set it somewhat apart from some of its regional comparators, that sort of low intensity nature, though maybe that's somewhat changing. I'll sort of say something about that. So this chapter, I think, is an excellent example of what I was just talking about, which is, the accessibility that Sean was referring to, but also it's grounded in, sort of the cutting edge of scholarship and political science and of empirical research on Jordan. And sort of bringing all of those things together in an important way that sort of really sheds light on things and also inserts, Sean's, sort of increasing compendium of work on civil military relations in Jordan as well. So there's this really great sort of detailed sort of section on Jordan's coercive apparatus, and which is both extensive and diverse and can be kind of confusing. So this leads to chapter 6 on contentious politics in Jordan, which importantly highlights the ubiquity of protest and activism in Jordan, despite the looming threat of state repression and also Jordan's reputation as an island of stability. And this is something that that is close to my heart in terms of how I understand Jordan. And it's sort of a trope that, is one that I sort of, you talk about the Arab Spring in Jordan and people's eyes kind of are like, what do you mean, kind of thing. So where I wanted to sort of add something or maybe sort of get your sense of things was coming right off the chapters on the strategy of authoritarian rule and Jordan's long history of pro-democracy movements. I was sort of expecting maybe a discussion of what role protest plays in the kingdom's authoritarian politics. How does it fit in this coercion consent kind of dichotomy? And so, to sort of ground that a little bit, Schwedler and Martinez's recent work in particular, points to the sort of ambivalent nature of protest and activism under authoritarianism. I mean, there's a sort of broader sort of scholarship on this. But, so on the one hand, protests place pressure on regime actors at various points, and they may compel some kind of change in behavior. But on the other hand, protests may also sort of reify those autocratic institutions. Protests can be subversive and transgressive, but they can also be a release valve, provide a veneer of a legitimacy, or in a sort of more of a moral economy perspective, they can legitimize the status quo ante by actively calling for the return of the kinds of consent generating inducements that are actually the sort of pillar of authoritarian consent generation. So as a useful theoretical lens here, I think also there's sort of this dichotomy from Charles Tilly of like transgressive versus contained contention that kind of gets at some of this too. So I guess to put that in the form of a question, if you could say more about how you see contentious politics and authoritarianism in Jordan, especially now that we're seeing this like serious and I think extreme crackdown on popular politics in Jordan, with the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Teachers Syndicate. And I think this matters for a couple of reasons, and it probably matters for more than that, I think. But a couple that I'll sort of point out. First, if sort of if this sort of constrained but vibrant arena of popular politics in Jordan is part and parcel of the sort of upgraded authoritarianism in the kingdom, then what is sort of significantly narrowing it in the way that we've seen? Does this leave citizens with fewer sort of, in sort of Jeff Goodwin's terms, like ways out, that might sort of lead to different kinds of activism and so forth. And then also, should we think of this recent wave of crackdowns as a response to the increasing transgressiveness of protests in Jordan, or is it simply just this sort of the strategic moment and the sort of opportunism in response to these external events like the October 7th or the pandemic before that? So just to conclude, I'll say that putting myself back in my researcher shoes back in 2018, that anyone on any level should count themselves lucky to have access to this book now. And I'm also really excited to be able to use this to put in front of my students. So thanks for this opportunity, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Matt. That was really great, and I'm glad we have some more questions for the discussion coming up. I want to jump over to Jamal now for his thoughts on the book and any additional analysis on Jordan. Jamal, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Alex. I would like to begin by expressing my sincere appreciation for Sean Yom's book and for his effort to debunk the persistent stream of misguided discourse about what Jordan is supposed to be to outsiders. His work instead advocates the importance of perceiving Jordan on its own terms by engaging the deeper dynamics that have shaped and continuously to shaping the state. Yom's analysis, from my point of view, prompts me to shed light on a long uncrossed distance between observation and practice. It invites reflection on how Jordan is seen not only by external observers, but also by some of its own citizens. His requires a reminder that, or my approach requires a reminder that political theory and political theorization must encompass adscription, explanation, ascription, and prescription, making any political theorization of a country ultimately a framework for a political option. As a practitioner, from my perspective as a Jordanian and a political actor in Jordan, my concern is to shift the focus from the question of why to the question of how. Answering why a country is as it is requires a panoramic review of the power dynamics that shaped it. Every state, including the United States, is the product of a historical flux of conflict and contestation, one governed by the logic of equifinality, and that could be explained through a counterfactual reasoning. Sean Yom's book provides an intellectual framework to establish the reasonability of bringing ground-level actors into the conversation. Ultimately, the binary framing of regime collapse versus regime's continuity is itself a product of power dynamic, one reinforced by the ongoing production of predetermined narrative about Jordan. Some Western intellectuals, knowingly or not, have become complicit in an autocratic strategy that sidelines essential component of local actors. In the remaining time I have, I hope to invoke discussion from an alternative perspective. The recently framed Jordanian opposition movement, and which is one of the factors maybe shaping the current movement in Jordan. They call themselves the Jordanian Democratic Republic Movement. This movement started or arose from the deep sense of despair regarding the possibility of genuine reform. It calls to restore state, or their main slogan, restore state power and resources. It rooted in a historical reinterpretation of Jordan's early years, particularly the period between the collapse of the Arab government in Damascus and Churchill meeting with Abdullah I. This perspective draws an correspondence between Herbert Samuel in Jerusalem and the British government in London at that time, suggesting that Abdullah I was deployed primarily as an instrument of a British strategy to delay a costly military campaign after World War I, the campaign which been done after a few years. From the standpoint of an actor, it's an essential to revisit the event flux between the Battle of Maysalun in July 1920 and the Churchill-Abdullah meeting in March 1921, as well as the clashes of 1923 and 1924 between Jordanians and combined British Abdullah forces. By the way, the forces at that time included no Jordanian among their ranks. The forces used by the British and Abdullah to compel Jordanians and to control Jordan was without any Jordanians. This episode, including the campaign to subdue Jordanians rebel across the country. By contrast, one of them was Ode Abu Tayyeh, who been in jail for years, the controversial figure of the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire in 1916. While analyzing autocratic techniques remains important, the more urgent task, one that many Jordanians ask daily, is to confront the central question: what could democratize Jordan? The debate in Jordan is shifting from why Jordan is not a democratic state to question how to democratize Jordan, or how democratization can be achieved in Jordan. And even more critically, is democratization possible? Or the critical question, is democratization possible while the ruling family remains in palace? These quick reflections, or these my quick reflections to acknowledge Sean Yom's important contribution to his exploration of the ground actors in Jordan. And finally, I want to extend my real appreciation to this book and to making a challenge or raising a possible challenge of many mainstream writings about Jordan. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jamal, for that analysis and review of the book. I think we have some more solid stuff for our discussion. I want to go over, before we go to that discussion, which Yara will kick off in just a moment. I want to go to Sarah Lee for a few comments on the book and on Jordan. Sarah Lee, you can go ahead.
Thanks. I'm actually going to truncate my remarks dramatically because I really want us to have time for discussion of this important book, particularly because we have such a large number of participants, many of whom appear to be from the region, which is the most important thing at all. I just want to say, sort of echoing Jamal's comments, my personal appreciation for Sean's book, primarily for the way that it centers the experience of the Jordanian people and not the Jordanian government in service to external agents and external actors. I won't share my political analysis, which I think, in fact, will mirror many of yours and end up repeating what some of you have said about the Jordanian government's shortcomings and its broken promises to the Jordanian people to democratize. But I do think that my personal experience in many ways exemplifies the diversity and paradox of Jordan. So I just wanted to share that because it really, reading Sean's book over the past couple of days made me think about my family's history from the lens of what Sean was describing, of how the government has managed to survive, how the monarchy has managed to survive in this made-up country that is Jordan. I've known Jordan since I was a child. My family were Armenian refugees in Amman. They fled from Jerusalem in 1948. When they arrived in Amman, there were no houses for them to rent. They stayed in tents until they could even find a house to rent. And my grandfather, an Armenian Christian, worked as a tailor in downtown Amman back when suits were only custom made. So he actually ended up having a very good business. But I think the experience showed that, even from decades ago, soon after its founding, it was not only an incredibly diverse community, a diverse country, but also a refuge for so many. It was a refuge for my family for which I will always be grateful to Jordan and to everything that has made up the stability that offered refuge for not just Armenians, but Palestinians fleeing the catastrophe, the Nakba, for Iraqis fleeing the Iraq War, for Syrians fleeing the war in Syria. The hospitality and generosity of the Jordanian people was unparalleled. But at the same time, Jordan was also our catastrophe. My grandmother and uncle were murdered at our home in Amman during the buildup to the violence and chaos of Black September. And my earliest memories as a child was that fighting, the killing, the guns, the soldiers. My aunt married a young Palestinian Christian, Hanna Najjar, who went on to achieve the highest rank available for a Christian in the Jordanian Air Force, which was, of course, headed by a Circassian who, this sort of by an unwritten rule would be heading the Air Force. And, so many of my family members are now buried in Amman. Many still live there. So I feel like I have many, many decades of insight and personal understanding of how the stability of Jordan, while it has been born on the backs of Jordanians who have no political freedom, who have no democracy, has also paradoxically served as a refuge of stability and safety for so many peoples. And I am, as Sean sort of alluded to, extremely concerned of what will come of Israeli genocide and belligerence and very clear plans to push out Palestinians who remain in the West Bank to Jordan. I do believe that it will be to the advantage and the strength of the country to democratize, to face these challenges. But I just wanted to briefly share that because I thought that so much of what Sean was describing from an academic perspective, from an analytic perspective, made me think of the sort of the personal experiences and paradoxes of a family's experience in Jordan. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Sarah Lee, and really, really, interesting family background and really personal touch, right? That's really important to this, I would say, as well. I want to really quickly hand it over now to Yara, who's going to kind of get our discussion started here. Yara, you can go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. First, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this panel. I also want to begin by saying how much I genuinely enjoyed reading Sean Yom's book. I've admired Dr. Yom's scholarship for years and relied on his earlier work while writing my master's thesis. So having the chance to engage with this new book felt both familiar and deeply rewarding. As a Jordanian myself and someone who has been politically active in the country, I found myself moving through its chapter with a sense of recognition. Every part of this book spoke dynamics that are essential to understanding who we are as people and how our politics have been formed. What makes this book stand out is how it deeply engages with the country's political and social fabric, and as like many mentioned as well, it challenges the Orientalist cliches that often reduce Jordan to the, a story of stability, moderation, or tribal culture. Dr. Yom replaces these stereotypes with a grounded, historically informed account of how power actually works in Jordan. He shows that understanding Jordan requires looking beyond labels and paying attention to the people and politics that drive change on the ground. One of the main themes that struck me in Dr. Yom's book is the Trans-Jordanian-Palestinian divide, an issue that is essential to understand how power, loyalty, and representation operate in Jordan. Before diving into exploring how this divide originated and emerged or shaped Jordan's history, it's important to basically define both groups involved. Transjordanians or East Bank Jordanians are communities who are native to lands east of the Jordan River. As Yom described in his book, a political earthquake struck Jordan shortly after its independence in 1946. The Arab-Israeli Wars and the Palestinian Nakba of 1948, when Israel expelled and displaced almost 900,000 Palestinians, with the largest portion of them settling in Jordan. events that reshaped Jordan's demographics, turning it into a Palestinian majority country almost overnight. Palestinian origin Jordanians, on the other hand, are the descendants of these refugees who arrived in waves in 1948 and 1967. Today, as Yom mentioned earlier, Palestinians comprise the majority of Jordanian population, with official numbers ranging between 55 and 70%. This imbalance had made demography itself a politically charged topic in Jordan. As Dr. Yom mentioned in his book, since the 1970s, the state has avoided releasing any official numbers distinguishing origin, precisely because these numbers carry political meaning. For this reason, pinpointing the exact percentage of Jordanian or Palestinian origin is challenging. But it's also essential to note that the term Transjordanian is not ancient or natural. It emerged from colonial and early state-building institutions. Before the British created the Emirate of Transjordan in 1921, communities east of the Jordan River were highly diverse and regionally connected. The north had ties to Syria through families, trade, and political networks. The central Balkan region was linked through land routes to Palestine, especially Nablus and Jerusalem, and the south maintained connections to the Hijaz, now Saudi Arabia, through tribal ties. So before 1921, none of these people identified as Jordanian. From 1948, however, until the late 1960s, Jordanians and Palestinians were deeply intertwined, not only socially, but politically as well. And they even fought wars together, as seen when the Jordanian army and the Palestinian Fidayeen units curbed an Israeli invasion attempt of Jordan, an event known as the Battle of Karama in 1968. The Jordanian parliament as well, in the 1950s, equally split seats between the East Bank and the West Bank when the West Bank was under the control of Jordan. Even the Jordanian forces included a large number of Palestinians in their rank, and at the same time, many Jordanians joined the Palestinian Fidayeen units. This mutual participation blurred the lines between Jordanian, Palestinian, and reinforced a sense of shared struggle. Tensions grew, though, as Palestinian armed factions became more autonomous and challenged the state authority. For the monarchy, whose core supporters were East Bank Jordanians, this was existential. The result were the unfortunate events that Sarah Lee mentioned earlier of Black September in 1971, when the Jordanian army expelled Palestinian Fidayeen militants in a brief but bloody armed conflict. Black September left two sharply distinct memories in Jordan. For many East Bankers, it was a moment of political restoration, defending the national order and the monarchy. Palestinian Jordanians, however, recall a very different experience. It was a moment that marked the beginning of systemic marginalization. Thousands were arrested on fabricated sedition charges, refugee camps were shelled, and entire communities were treated as disloyal, despite the fact that most of them had nothing to do with the conflict. After Black September, the political system further entrenched this divide. Many Palestinian Jordanians were purged from the army and state institutions, leading to these institutions to be dominated solely by Transjordanian tribes. Cabinets and senior state positions also favor Transjordanians, and electoral districts overrepresent rural areas where there's a large Transjordanian presence, and leaving urban majority districts, which tend to elect opposition blocs, underrepresented. Political protests in Palestinian majority areas were treated with greater suspicion, while East Bank towns often saw concessions. This reshaping of the state apparatus deepened the political and social separation between East Bank Jordanians and Palestinian origin Jordanians. It ties directly into a key source of regime stability, the politics of fear. Some East Bank Jordanians and regime loyalists worry that democratization could shift power towards the Palestinian majority, destabilizing the delicate demographic balance. External pressures, especially the far-right Israeli claim that Jordan is Palestine and should therefore replace an independent Palestinian state, intensify these fears. Yet, despite these historical divisions, hope remains. The divide does not define the future. Jordanians and Palestinians have mobilized together many times over the years, from the 1989 uprising to the 2011 Hirak to major labor and civil movements. The memories of Black September are fading. And with 2/3 of the population under 30, many other Jordanians do not see themselves through the old identity categories. They are more unified by a shared aspiration for political freedom and democratization. They dream of a Jordan where the labels Transjordanian, Palestinian matter less than shared citizenship, equality, and the promise of democratic future. So, given everything that we've discussed about how this divide was constructed and institutionalized, I would like to raise a question to Dr. Young first, and maybe we kick it off to the group to kind of like let us know what they think about this. My question is, if Jordan were to democratize, do you think the divide would intensify in competition for political power, or would it diminish as institutions normalize political participation? And kind of like building on that, what specific institutional reforms, whether they are electoral, party-based, or administrative, do you believe are necessary to prevent democratization from triggering such identity backlash, and instead kind of like channel it towards cross-communal cooperation? Thank you so much.
Sean, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry.
Did we want to pitch it to more to collect more questions from the participants, or do
Let's
we
go
want to
with
have a group
let's start. Yeah,
discussion
yeah.
now?
Let's go with Yara's question first in a discussion, and we can answer some of the questions from Ben and Matt as well, and as we have questions come in from the audience.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, I know. Thanks for clarifying. Yara, yeah, you raise some provocative questions. Let me tackle the first one because the question about what happens to the social dynamic between associated with the Transjordanian and Palestinian sort of relationship at a communal level if Jordan democratizes. I mean, I would say that's the billion dinar question that we perpetually ask in Jordan. I think that there are certain stakeholders in the Jordanian state who generally tend to be Transjordanian, although not exclusively, but most of them are, who have a particular vision of what would happen if Jordan democratizes. I mean, their vision is that Jordan would be a Palestinian dominant state. It would be one where there'd be a Palestinian oriented government. Palestinians would be represented much more heavily in parliament or government. Some, as we know, some of the, I think, more extreme chauvinists among Transjordanians believe that there wouldn't be a monarchy anymore, that it would be the very thing that they're trying to avoid by preventing a second Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank. It would effectively be the Jordan being Palestine scenario without there having to be a Watan el Badil option because the Palestinians would simply use their numbers at the ballot box to take over. Like that would be their, I think, their very xenophobic vision. I don't agree. Like, so from my perspective, I think that knee-jerk fear is precisely why periodic efforts to equalize the social balance and to ask really hard political questions about why is it 55 years after Black September, is there still effectively a political division of labor in Jordan? And why do Palestinian Jordanians today, despite the fading memories of that war, and despite that there is less discrimination and there are less communal tensions than before, there's plenty of intermarriage. The idea that you can know Jordan solely through the Palestinian Transjordanian lens is a very kind of late 20th century idea. It's become fuzzy, it's become complicated, and we can agree upon all that. Like that can be true, but what's also true is that there is no parliament and no government that fairly represents Palestinian Jordanian citizens to the degree that they represent in the citizenry. Like both things can be true. And I think what I mentioned earlier is that whenever there are periodic efforts to to realign this social balance. Like I think about the National Agenda Reform Project of Marwan Muashir in 2005 and 6. I think about the most recent political modernization Royal Committee that for about a half day tried to touch this issue, and then they were guided away from this issue by directives from above. It's very frustrating because this is a question that has to be answered in order for Jordan to further commit to democratic reforms. But I would say it's not that bad things will happen, which is the problem. It's that there is a chronic inability among political stakeholders to even want to answer the question and to see it through, which is the real problem. Like I would also say this, and I'll end here. Like Jordan would not be the first, country in the world, and it certainly won't be the last, where there are real social and communal divisions which are rooted in historical conflict, yes, but they're also complicated, they're fuzzy, they're not as sharp as they're used to be. The younger Jordanians that one can talk to, we all know this is true, will tell you that this matters far less to them. The question that would instantly identify their parents that you would ask to anyone in Arabic, min wain inti or min wain inta, doesn't mean that much to younger Jordanians today when their primary struggle is I'm 5 years out of university. I don't have a job. There's corruption everywhere. There's endemic inequality. My land is about to absorb more refugees from a U.S. Israeli hegemonic project to take over Palestine, and I don't have room to breathe anymore. Like in that context, the idea that these high level issues about identity and who should hold power in Jordan, I think matters far less than what the meaning of daily justice is. I think the problem, again, is that the inability to even want to play out this question on just on a quotidian level for certain stakeholders is I mean, that is, in my view, the real struggle. But Jordan wouldn't be the first country with communal divisions to have to wrestle with this. It won't be the last. But simply having that division doesn't mean, I think, it doesn't portend a dark future and to any degree. I mean, that future is yet to be, is going to be written by the current youth cohort of activists and political future politicians and thinkers who kind of drive the country today. And I'm as eager as anyone to see that country, to see that future play out.
Thank you. If I may, just to remind everyone with facts about democracy, what could protect Jordan from any Israeli threat is not by allowing monopolization of power by the king and his family. This is one. Second, let's remember that democracy will not sell out Jordan because after historically, Yaqub Ziyadin elected in 1956 from Jerusalem by people in Jerusalem.
And even
And
the Suleiman Nabilsi government as well. Like it was,
no, Yaqub
yeah.
Ziyadin, يعني Yaqub Ziyadin wasn't in the government, but he was elected in Jerusalem. And lately, we can remember the late Shbelat from Tafile, elected in Amman 90% of the vote of his votes by Palestinian voters. It's a big mistake to to imagine that the Palestinian voters will vote only for Palestinian candidates and the vice versa. This is very important to remember. I can in Irbid in 1966, Irbid voted for someone Al-Khayyat from Nablus. He's not from Irbid. This is very big mistake that to raise fears that democracy could help the Israeli projects in Jordan. This is actually just a myth or sort of illusion to justify the status quo, to justify corruption, to justify despotism in Jordan. In fact, democracy is the only way to protect Jordanian rights and the Palestinian rights and to enhance the sense of nationality or the sense of identity for both. And after all, people's identity or the national identity of people, it's not something stagnant and invented from history. It's in the making. And there is no problem for the sense of identity of Jordanians to be developed and the sense of Palestinians to be developed. After all, the ruling family in Jordan, they are not Jordanian. Let's remember that. And this is a fact. That's just, I don't want to talk more about this, just to kick off these points. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a the demographics of Jordan is such a sensitive issue, and as you said, I second that. Like these lines are very blurry. Palestinians and Jordanians are more deeply intertwined. As I said, also the new generation as well is just the divide now is more like pro-democracy versus anti-democracy rather than Palestinian versus Jordanian. But I feel like the monarchy plays on that fear and kind of convinces people that democratization would bring that kind of like threat of al-Watan al-Badil or the threat of, Jordan becoming Palestine. You and I know that this is not true, but a lot of people fall for it. So I guess maybe my question would be is how can one debunk such myths or such, fears that are being promoted to the Jordanian public? Thank you.
In this case, I yeah, I do accept the question.
Okay, Sean, Matt, Ben, does anyone want to comment further on that, or maybe Sean, I
If
saw you on
if
mute.
if no one wants to discuss يعني rephrase the question, I have 2 points actually about it. In fact, there is actual democratic movement in Jordan, and they are tackling this issue vividly and with a cumulative success. Not very, يعني it's not or they have not changed the balance of power in the country, but I think it's a matter of time. With the persistence, with continuity, there is no future for يعني disposit dictators in the region in general, and I'm sure there is no future for this family in Jordan, especially after they have really taken over more than 25% of the national economy or of the GDP of the country in all sectors. So that's why, from my point of view, all of these fears to defend the status quo, it's a matter of time to be collapsed and to be faded away very soon.
Wonderful, thanks, Jamal. We do have some questions in coming in the Q&A, and so I might just quickly turn to that really quickly. We have one question that kind of it references Sean's previous article titled "Jordan is Becoming a Banana Kingdom." I'm personally not familiar, but the question essentially is it observes the Trump strategy with respect to Jordan. How is the Trump administration approaching Jordan today, and um, how how does the Trump administration's supposed shift in focus from the Middle East kind of impact U.S.-Jordanian relations? That's for Sean. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Now, I can certainly address this because I think talking about U.S. Jordanian relations is absolutely central to understanding Jordan's future trajectory. Because as Matt and Ben know, whether we use the lexicon of imperialism or just go with more conventional international relations language like client state, right? It is undeniable that Jordan, in macro structural terms, is a state that is subordinate geopolitically, financially, and militarily to the United States. And so understanding, I think, the nuances of what the Trump administration wants and how it sees Jordan is really important. There are a few ways to tackle this in terms of U.S. Jordanian dynamics. Number one, I would say that Jordan, whether this is gifted by the United States or part of its self-framing, has long been one of the most important Arab allies of Washington. It's important to remember that King Abdullah was the first Arab head of state to visit every sitting president in office since the Obama years, since Obama's first term. He was beaten to the punch with the Bush administration in Bush's first term only by Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. He was the second Arab head of state to visit Washington during Bush's first term. So the Jordanian government likes to style itself as one of those very intimate Arab allies of the United States. But part of that diplomatic alignment also means that whenever there are sudden shifts in American policy, which generally imbricate Jordan as a kingdom territorially and economically as part of a broader arc of American war making and dominance in the region, whenever US foreign policy suddenly shifts, it can be very jarring to the Jordanian leadership. So I'll give you some examples. Um, Jordan carved out, I would say, a newfound role after 9/11 and the War on Terror by being a very close-knit geopolitical ally of the United States during that War on Terror, and during also the subsequent, after the Arab Spring, the Syrian Civil War. The military infrastructure that NATO countries and the United States have built and are building right now in Jordan. And I think Ben's work kind of illustrates this perfectly, which are implicated within Jordan's commercial economy. It implicates the Jordanian state. That Western infrastructure is something that Jordan hasn't seen really since its years as a British mandate. The United States is undergoing a massive military buildup in Jordan now. Britain has its own air base. The French have their own air base. The Germans are running space from a Jordanian air base. NATO has a liaison office in Amman, surprisingly. And so Jordan is part and parcel of what the US is doing in Syria, in Iraq, in the Gulf, and in Israel, Palestine, and has consistently been that way. That military presence makes Jordan it makes Jordan extremely secure, right? There's a border security system on the US Jordan, I'm sorry, on the Jordanian, Syrian, and Jordanian Iraqi borders, which was built by Raytheon Company about 15 years ago. So that's very important. That the problem is that when there's divergence on certain key wedge issues like Palestine, the Jordanians don't have any real room to breathe because they are towing the American line. And so, whenever there was at least symbolic admission that there'd be a two-state solution in Palestine and that not everything the Israeli government was doing, for instance, in Gaza during previous Gaza wars, was okay, there was some room to breathe in Amman that maybe Washington would turn a corner and that maybe the US would find some footing and get the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government back to the negotiating table and to resuscitate the Oslo process. The Trump administration, like both administrations, like both regimes, like the first regime, which was 2016 to 2020, and then the second regime, which is now, have just torn up that playbook. Um, Although the Jordanian leadership didn't mind Trump's hardline anti-Iranian policy in the late 2010s, it abhorred Trump's green light to Israel to, for instance, declare Jerusalem as its undivided capital, to cut off foreign aid to the Palestine Liberation Organization, and to impose a whole bevy of other pro-Israeli policies. I would say everything that Trump has done in his second term or regime has similarly alarmed the Jordanians, and not just including the US underwriting the Israeli war machine, but also the fact that the US has been very, very just morally vacuous on the issue of illegal settlements inside the West Bank. The one thing that the Trump administration has done, like in the past year, I can't believe he's only been in office for 1 year, but in the past year has been his October 2025 concession that he did not support outright annexation of the West Bank. Like that's the one thing he has said that's pleased the Jordanians. But otherwise, the Jordanians, I feel right now, in terms of foreign policy, are extremely nervous that all of the US-Israeli alliance that has been built over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly since the 1990s in Oslo, is building towards a crescendo that is going to a crescendo that is going to be West Bank annexation. and the forcible expulsion of more Palestinians in a second Nakba to Jordan. Like I'd say that's the existential fear right now inside royal decision-making circles, inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's on the top of the list whenever you talk to Jordanian officials at the UN and NATO meetings in Washington, D.C. and London. It's the one thing they're trying to avoid. And the problem is that the Jordanians don't have maneuvering space in this matter because they have this bargain subordinate relationship to American power that they inked about 3 generations ago in the late 1950s. And that's meant that they're going along for the ride in terms of American hegemony, whether it's in good times or in bad times. And right now, those times are really bad. And that's why I think that over the next few years of the Trump administration or regime, I think it's going to be all hands on deck in terms of what the Jordanians try to do to mitigate the Palestine issue. I mean, the Jordanian military is reenacting conscription in 2026. And yeah, I mean, that's partly symbolic and partly for economic reasons. But rhetorically speaking, it does suggest that the Jordan's taking a much more martial posture against Israel and Palestine now, and that's partly because of everything they've seen from this Trump administration over the past year, which has been an unmitigated disaster for pretty much like not just about 4/5 of the Middle East, but a good part of the American population as well, and for much of the world. So we'll see where that goes.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sean. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to jump in. Yara, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, there's something that you mentioned earlier when you were speaking, is that Jordan has the most to gain and the most to lose if Palestinian statehood would happen. So can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that, Yara? You cut out just in the middle of your sentence, your audio
Oh,
when you were giving your punchline. Yeah. What was this? What was the
oh
question?
yeah, of course. Oh, earlier you mentioned that Jordan has like the most to lose and the most to
Mhm.
gain if Palestinian statehood would happen. So I was just wondering, like, could you elaborate maybe on that? How
Yeah, so
can it
I
have
mean,
so much to lose?
the Hashemites for generations, as we all know, have invested so heavily on the idea of Palestinian statehood being a pillar of foreign policy, partly because, as we know, the Hashemites claim custodianship over Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem, and that's a key part. I would say it's a bigger part for them than I think outsiders would see it in terms of their legitimacy, but they think that that's very important, and that's not trivial. But it's been a major part of their foreign policy for generations. And so the actualization of that two-state dream is something that would achieve a long-standing goal of theirs. I think it would satisfy not just a good part of their own foreign policy prerogatives, but I mean, it is a solidarity dream shared by both Transjordanians and Palestinian Jordanians. Obviously, not necessarily for the same reasons, but it is one of the things that kind of cross-cuts that divide and unites a lot of Jordanians together, particularly when they're protesting against Israel's bombardment and genocide in Gaza. Now, if you don't get Palestinian statehood, right, like what's the logical alternative? Like I would argue in following a lot of what I've seen written in the press and what just I personally believe and what many regional commentators believe, I would argue that the logical outcome of the death of the two-state solution is further Israeli irredentism and expansionism, and eventually the outright annexation of not just the West Bank, but Gaza as well. Like I'm seeing it right now in terms of the 20-point peace plan and the future peacekeeping force, the international stabilization force, and the realization that they're probably going to be patrolling what the Israelis behind what the Israelis call the yellow line because there's going to be a zone of Israeli occupation in Gaza too. Like this is how colonial settler movements start through forcible imperial occupation. And like the logical outcome of the death of Palestinian statehood is a one-state solution and Israeli expansionism into the West Bank. And even if they give Palestinians their choice, which they probably won't, but if they give them a choice, do you live inside an apartheid state or do you go to Jordan Or like, what choice do we think they would pick? And so either they're forcibly expelled or they're legally encouraged to migrate. But either way, they're ending up in Jordan. And then the right-wing Zionists have their dream that, Jordan is Palestine, al-Watan al-Badil. Jordan is the substitute homeland for Palestinians. And of all the Arab states, the frontline states, Jordan has the most to lose because unlike Lebanon and Syria and Egypt, which also absorbed Palestinian refugees, the 1954 nationality law and Jordan gave that first wave of West Bankers citizenship. And the Palestinians that will be coming over, would ostensibly and rightly, I would say, expect the same. But, how do you adjudicate that claim, given the very imbalanced political structure of Jordan, in which Palestinians already don't have much of a voice at all? And what if Transjordanians are not 40% of the populace, but they're 10%, they're 15%, they're 20%? Like that's a recipe for, I wouldn't say disaster, but that's a recipe for a real gut check in terms of having discussions about national identity and the purpose of Jordan and the nature of Jordanian political order, which a good number of Jordanian stakeholders in the state have never wanted to have. And forcing them to have that discussion is something that they're trying to avoid. And so they would see this as losing out as well. So, I mean, that underlies why I think Jordan has the most to gain and the most to lose with the rise or the death, the final terminal kind of demise of of the Palestinian state.
Thanks, Sean. I know we're getting a little bit near the end here. I do just want to go to one more question in the Q&A, if you don't mind.
Mhm.
You already kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of U.S.-Jordanian relations and Jordan being reliant on U.S. support in a number of ways. The question essentially is, with decreased foreign aid coming out of the Trump administration, with their deprioritization of foreign aid, um, how can that impact Jordan? How will it impact Jordan? And what does that really look like in the future, perhaps in the near and medium term?
Well, I mean, so the cutback of USAID assistance to civil society organizations cause I mean, it caused job losses in Jordan. I've seen estimates range from 2,000 to 20,000 jobs in the local development sector and the secondary and tertiary contractors who use USAID grants to operate. I mean, it's already cost the Jordanian economy a lot. I think what Omar Zayed is referring to is if the biggest chunk of U.S. economic aid, which is not that civil society assistance, but cash payments to the Jordanian budget, like in USAID lingo, it's called ESF, Economic Support Fund payments. And they're basically just cash payments made to the Central Bank of Jordan that the Jordanian government treats as fiscal revenues, as if it collected them via taxes. And so if those payments get cut off, that would be a fiscal catastrophe because I mean, unlike other forms of foreign aid, that's fungible revenue, right? So the World Bank gives loans, the IMF gives loans, the EU gives lots of money, but those are tied up in specific developmental outcomes or projects. ESF payments, USAID financial payments, which are not tied to civil society, largely comprise these budgetary revenue payments designed to keep the Jordanian government solvent. If that goes, that would be an unmitigated problem for Jordan because this is an entire political economy that has matured and revolved around the idea that there's always going to be, like my foreign policy chapter, expounds upon this. There's always going to be a foreign donor, usually the U.S. or an allied state, that's going to bail the government out when things get really bad in fiscal terms. And so, if that ceases to exist, that big chunk of U.S. aid, I mean, it'd be a disaster. Jordan would probably default on its public debt. It would be like the 1988 and 89 economic crisis all over again. In the worst case scenario, the government would be unable to make salary for the public sector, which comprises 30% of the national budget. And in general, things would come screeching to a halt. I think, by the way, that's one of the reasons why, despite some early talk about cutting that aid budget, the bipartisan consensus in Washington is that the big chunk of that Jordanian aid budget wasn't to be touched with the USAID cutbacks in spring 2025. I think that's partly because, again, Jordan's subordinate status comes into the picture. Jordan's sort of countenance to both Republican and Democratic lawmakers is almost always through vis-a-vis Israel. right? They see Jordan as this stable, pro-American kingdom protecting Israel's eastern flank. And I think for a variety of reasons, their fear was that if there's instability in Jordan caused by the US pullback of military economic assistance, that's bad for Israel. And we can't have that. But that underscores one of the themes of my book. I mean, if we're only going to look at Jordan through its value to other actors, like a right-wing government in Israel or to like Western policymakers, we're not actually seeing Jordan. We're seeing a cartographic placeholder on a map that embodies these outside strategic interests that just want it to be there. But then that's all it's going to be. It's simply going to be there. And one of the questions I kind of ask in my book, and I'll end on this, is like, isn't it really daring when Jordanians themselves, when they're protesting, kind of ask this question, why can't we be more than simply here? Like, why can't Jordan be more than a country that just survives? Like, why can't this country be more than simply a conceptual kind of a conceptual marker for our own insecurities and our own double standards in the Middle East? And I think it can, but that requires, I think, a clear moral conscience, which I think a great many people in Washington, not to mention half of Jordan neighbors, don't have right now.
Well said, Sean. And I think that actually ends us on a perhaps slightly depressing but strong note. And so, Sean, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank all of our panelists for their time. Sean, again, your book is excellent, and I'm going to reshare a link to it in the chat alongside the book review in Dawn's Democracy in Exile, as well as a link to Dawn. If you want to support our work, review our work, our website is also in the chat. Again, thank you, everyone. This is an absolutely excellent discussion, and hopefully we'll see everyone for the next one.